The Dhamma for today is the three Akusalamūlani, the roots of unwholesomeness, or as they say in English, the root of evil. So it means these are the roots of all evil. Any evil that arises in the world is rooted in these three things. The three roots of all evil are greed, lobha, greed, dosa, anger, and moha, delusion. Lobha, dosa, moha. An essential aspect of the Buddha's teaching. Meaning is, there's no other source of evil in the world. Anything else that we point to as a source of evil is only an instrument, you could say, of evil. It means that evil only exists in the hearts of individual beings. Anything else that you might point to outside in the external world as evil, it's only evil in conjunction with the qualities of mind that create it or that react to it. So first, let's talk about what we mean by evil, or akusala. Akusala doesn't mean literally evil, but that's the idea. It doesn't matter which word you use. You can use different words as long as you explain what you mean. Akusala means unwholesome or even unskillful in certain instances. Bad is the idea. So what is considered bad in Buddhism? Why do we consider that greed, anger, and delusion are bad, and how do we determine that they're bad? What is the qualification that something has to possess in order to be unwholesome, evil, bad? So in Buddhism, the simple answer is that it causes suffering. There's no external reliance on God or any source of authority. There's not even anything really intrinsic to the things in the sense of being bad themselves. It's what they cause. They're bad because of what they bring. They're bad because of the effect that they have. And so this is another strong claim. The first strong claim is that these are the only things that are evil. That's a bold claim. The next bold claim is these are also the only things that cause suffering, which is hard for most people to swallow. We think, well, there's many things that cause suffering. So again, it can be allowed that, depending how you mean by suffering, these aren't the only things that directly cause suffering. But without these three, suffering would cease, is the point. And there's nothing else you can say that about. So yes, you get stung by a bee, or you get a cramp, or you get sick, or you get old. These are all causes of suffering. But they only come about because of greed, anger, and delusion in an ultimate sense. Even birth only comes about because of greed, because of the three defilements, these three things. So that's the meaning of evil, is that they are the cause of suffering. We practice, one way of describing our practice is that we practice in order to see this, right? If we look at the Four Noble Truths, that's what we're learning. That greed is the cause of suffering. And I'll get into how that relates to the other two in a second. But we can say in general, these unwholesome states, these are the cause of suffering. And this is what we discover through our practice. We start to see how greed leads to suffering, how anger leads to suffering, how delusion leads to suffering. And that's what's meant by evil. As to what these are, again, we use words. And words have already existing meanings in the language, but we have to pick some word. And so we pick lobha, dosa, and moha, and in English we pick translations as greed, anger, and delusion. But you have to understand these are just words, and they don't mean exactly what they would mean in English, not exactly. Greed doesn't just mean a person who doesn't have enough money and who is going out of their way to take things from others. Greed means any attraction to anything, any sense of liking, desire. And so it covers a broad spectrum of experiences. Liking an experience of seeing or hearing, well, that's lobha. Wanting something that you don't have, that's lobha. Any even little bit of wanting is what we call greed. That's just the name for it. It's in the category. So you can look at these three as categories of things. They're in fact categories of minds. So a mind is, in Buddhism, a mind is a moment of experience. The mind is that moment, or that aspect of the moment of experience that experiences the experience, that is aware of the experience. And some of those moments of experience are associated with or contain in them greed. They contain in them desire. And then some contain in them anger, some contain in them delusion. Anger, as opposed to greed, is really just its opposite. It doesn't mean anger. Anger is not anger. The word anger we use as a category to cover anger, but to also cover any kind of disliking whatsoever, any kind of aversion whatsoever. You dislike the pain, it doesn't mean you're angry at the pain, but yes, in a sense it actually does. It's the same, because it's the same quality of mind. And if you study the Abhidhamma, you can see this. There's 12 different unwholesome states, and 8 of them are lobha, are greed. 2 of them are anger, and 2 of them are delusion. They're very specific moments of experience. And why there's 8, why there's 2, this is really just technical. It means because greed can have different qualities to it. Greed is an interesting one. It's worth describing. Greed is hard to overcome because it's associated either with a neutral feeling or a pleasant feeling. Remember we said greed is the cause of suffering. Greed is not suffering. You're not suffering at the moment of greed. You're usually quite happy. And you think, how could this be bad? This feels so good. It's pleasant. Greed can be associated with wrong view, the belief that it's good to have greed. It can also be dissociated from wrong view. And it can be prompted and unprompted. But if you want to learn about that, you can study the Abhidhamma. For anger is simple. It's always associated with an unpleasant feeling. And you can never have a view that this is a good thing. It can never be associated with wrong view in the same way as greed, I don't think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And delusion, the thing about delusion is a word that means any kind of misunderstanding or misapprehension. It literally means darkness or cloudiness. Moha is like a fog, lack of clarity. But it covers, again, it's a category. It covers many different things. It covers wrong view, it covers ignorance, any kind of distorted perception of reality, distorted or incomplete. Even just not being aware of something, not seeing something clearly as it is delusion. And another thing to note is that, well, I said there are 2 distinct delusion minds. Most delusion is not those, or much of delusion is actually every single greed state of consciousness has delusion as well. You need delusion to have greed, and you need delusion to have anger. So there's delusion as a part of the mind. Means at the moment that you like something, it's because you don't see it clearly. Only because you could never see something clearly and also like it. That's the key to the Buddha's teaching. You could never see something clearly and get angry or dislike it. The clarity prevents the arising because it prevents the delusion, which allows for greed, which allows for anger. So these are what they're like. These are the explanations of what greed, anger, and delusion mean. A couple of other interesting aspects to them is how they're different in a general sense. They're different in terms of how strongly they are blamed in the world. It's just an observation that's of interest when discussing these things. And they're different in terms of how quickly they are to change, or quickly they are to disappear. How easy they are to be free from, at least momentarily. So greed is very little blamed in the world, or comparatively little blame, of little blame by people. But on the other hand, it is very slow to change. So if you think in the world, we're taught to be greedy, we're taught to consume, we're asked, which do you prefer? What kind of food do you like? Do you think this is beautiful? Am I beautiful? Am I handsome? Asking each other, do you like this dress? Do you like this shirt? Right? Our whole of our language as ordinary people is caught up, consumed by this. What games do you like? What television shows do you like? What music do you listen to? What do you like? You like. It's all about liking. Very little censure. Sure, when people are extremely greedy, of course we start to see the problem. But it's very hard to see the problem with greed. The Buddha talked a lot about the danger and how it's a very subtle and difficult thing to see, but the key is to eventually see the danger, of course, and how hard it is. He talked about how hard it is to see the danger in this quality of mind. Anger, on the other hand, is very much censured. Most people are not going to say, yeah, get angry. There are cases where people will argue that anger is good, it leads to social change, it leads to what they conceive of as good results. But generally speaking, nobody wants to be around an angry person. Boy, you're angry today. You're irritable. Of course, we don't blame people. Mostly we understand, everyone knows that in an ordinary situation, people get angry. But we still don't like it very much when people get angry. We don't even like it when we get angry. It's hard to feel good about being angry if it goes on for some time, because it's wretched. It's because anger is always associated with an unpleasant state of mind. Domanassa, the Vedanized domanassa, as opposed to the greed, where greed is associated with a pleasant mind or a neutral mind. And delusion, on the other hand, delusion is much censured and slow to change. So the other thing about anger is that it's quick to change. Greed, I didn't talk about. The greed is slow to change, anger is quick to change. So greed, the problem is because it's not very much censured, and because we don't see the danger, it changes slowly. But anger, you're quick to see, oh, this is a problem, and do something about it. Maybe you go and find something you enjoy, or maybe you go take a walk. If you're angry at someone, you find a way because you really want it to go away. It's easier to change it. Greed can persist. If you want something, you can want it for days and days. But delusion is much censured and slow to change. So delusion is things like, it's expressed by things like arrogance, conceit, even wrong views. If people are pushing their views on you, it can be unpleasant. But mostly we think of things like arrogance and conceit, stupidity in the sense of someone who is bullheaded or pig-headed, or however you say. Someone who is stubborn in their misunderstandings, people who stubbornly cling to their views that everyone can see are just wrong. Even when they're wrong, refusing to admit it. All of these things are based on delusion. Nobody says it's good that you're arrogant or conceited. We do sometimes say it's good to be proud, but not so much. Nobody really likes someone who is proud. We find it generally more pleasing when someone is humble. We feel threatened by other people who are proud, who are boastful, and people who cling to self and these sorts of things. People who are ignorant. Of course, it's more beautiful when someone is wise, when they have things to say that are impressive and helpful. If you go to someone for advice and they tell you something stupid, no one wants to hear that. You'd be very impressed. Oh, what you told me is really wise. That's great. Makes you appreciate that person. But if someone gives you a wrong advice, you start to look down on them. And it's also slow to change. It's hard to change your ways when you have wrong views. It's hard to get out of this delusion because it's like darkness. If you think of how could an animal become enlightened with their thick delusion? The delusion keeps them from ever even knowing that what they're doing is wrong. So same with humans. Delusion will stop you from knowing that greed is wrong, knowing that anger is wrong, knowing that delusion is wrong. You're in darkness, so even when you're arrogant, conceited, wrong view, all these things, you can't be really clearly aware of it, because that's the whole thing about delusion. It's a very big challenge. The other thing we can note about these things that's worth remembering is their specific results. The specific results relate to the three states of loss. So the 3 states of loss are hell, the animal realms, and the ghost realms. A person with lots of greed is the cause by which beings are reborn as ghosts. If you think of the classic ghost story, it's some being that is wailing and yearning and unable to move on. Like, this is just folklore. But the interesting thing about the folklore is that wherever you go, it aligns with this idea of a hunger, a thirst. If you read the Buddhist stories, you get a clearer picture that these are beings that are driven by desire, hounded by their unfulfilled desires. So if a person is more and more greedy in this life, they will come to look like a ghost even though they're alive. They will wither, they will become frail, they will become thin, or they'll become very fat, I suppose. But either way, they will be completely never being able to be satiated. And when they die, they're reborn as ghosts. Anger is the cause for being reborn in hell. So hell is a place of great suffering, of course, and you can see in a person who is angry, their face gets red like a demon, no? If you think of the classic folklore is that demons are red, well, in the West anyway. Your face gets red when you're angry, and anger is associated with pain, it's associated with suffering. Some people get so angry that their nose bleeds, they get angry that there's even apparently such anger that you vomit blood, or blood comes out of your mouth, just with such intense hatred. It burns up your organs even inside. And when a person dies with great anger, they're born in hell. And of course, a person who is consumed by great delusion is the cause for being reborn as an animal. So, a person who is completely in the dark, unwilling, uninterested in cultivating clarity, without any highness of mind. They have this clouded state of mind that they indulge in. People who consume alcohol, drugs, people who take marijuana just to get stoned, and you think, well, what's the problem with that? You're just stoned. Yeah, you're stoned like an animal. You're going to be reborn as a stoned being, a being with very little clarity. Dogs look like they're stoned all the time, or animals. There's very little clarity in the animal realm. We consider them, as humans in general, we consider them to be inferior, and I think that's reasonable because they have an extreme lack of any kind of clarity of mind, wisdom, anything like that. So that's in regards to where they lead. Now, they only really lead to these extremes of the hell realm, the animal realm, the ghost realm, if they relate to breaking the 5 precepts. So based on these three, if you go so far that you break the precepts, you break the precept out of anger by killing or so on, you break the precept out of greed by stealing and so on, you break the precept out of delusion by wrong view, it's not wrong, it's right, by justifying yourself, by creating all kinds of justification and that sort of thing, or belief in bad things. People who believe that animal sacrifice leads you to heaven, that sort of thing, delusion. Anything that leads you to break the 5 precepts, lying is a common one based on delusion. That will lead you to be reborn in the lower realms. So finally, talking about what we should do about this, what the practice is to free ourselves from these things. How these relate to our practice. Why should we learn about these things? Well, of course, we learn about them because of the cause of suffering. Okay, so how do we get rid of them? How do we end suffering, right? How does ending suffering relate to these 3? So there are 2 aspects of our practice that relates to directly to these 3 defilements, how we can describe our practice based on these 3 defilements. The first aspect is conventional or temporary, sort of the stopgap measures. The measures that exist outside of the Buddha's teaching even, but that were very much perfected or advanced in a way that never existed before by the Buddha. So this is in regards to the practice of samatha meditation. So with samatha meditation you can, or you might not even say samatha, but with ordinary types of meditation, where you, for example, cultivate an experience of the undesirability of things that you desire, especially the body. So the Buddha recognized that the body is the prime source of intense lust and greed, attraction to sexuality, sensuality, that sort of thing. And so he did teach his disciples quite regularly to pay attention to the actual nature of the body, to spend time considering the loathsomeness of the body. For example, that the hair on our head is like rice, but it's not rice growing fresh and green in fine dirt. It's growing in oil and flaky skin, just like you planted rice, but you planted it in a very smelly and greasy and slimy and unattractive place. Hair on the body is the same, with skin flaking off, and this hair in our armpits and in our groin area smells bad and gets oily and greasy and sweaty and so on. Our teeth, we like them. We think teeth are very beautiful, except when they're real. If you make them perfect, like the perfect smile, then of course you can whiten them and so on. But that's all artificial. The truth about teeth is that they're covered in saliva, which can smell foul. They're caked with all kinds of disgusting remnants of food, so that when you floss your teeth, you can taste the rotting food. And you have to brush your teeth daily, or else they get yellow and they get cracked and eaten away by bacteria. They have blood vessels inside them, like nerves, and they're surrounded by blood and stuck in the gums. They're really not that attractive. But you only see that if you practice this type of practice. Otherwise, you look at a smile and say, you have great teeth. Nobody has great teeth. Our teeth are just like things that are just stuck in the grossest place you can imagine. Blood and bone and flesh and skin. Nakha, the nails. The nails on our body, we think we paint our nails, we clip our nails, we look at our hands, and we're kind of attracted to them. But the truth about the nails is as well, they're stuck in blood and skin, and they continue to grow. You have to constantly be cutting them. If you don't cut them, then stuff gets underneath them, and they turn yellow, and the dirt accumulates. And there's nothing really, they're kind of just another aspect of the wholesomeness of the body. And the skin as well, our skin on our body is something that we try to make as beautiful as possible. We try to avoid the fact that it is quite unpleasant. Skin smells bad, skin flakes, and gets oily and greasy and sweaty. It's like a big bag of loathsomeness. We're like a big skin bag, a walking, talking bag of skin. Bag made of skin not full of great treasures. This skin bag is not full of gems and jewels and gold and silver. It's full of blood or urine and feces and all these kinds of things that are actually kind of disgusting. Now, this is just a conventional practice. Again, this isn't really touching on reality, because reality is there's nothing great or disgusting about the body. The body isn't even a thing that exists. There's only seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and feeling and thinking. And if you smell something, you thinking it bad is only your perception of it. However, because we've got a perversion in one way, thinking the body is beautiful, we can counteract that. We can counteract the delusion that cultivates lust by focusing on the loathsomeness. Likewise, for anger, we can cultivate loving kindness, at least to free ourselves from anger towards other beings, to prevent the arising of anger towards other beings. If we spend time cultivating metta, we can free ourselves from the arising of this terrible mind state. Wishing for all beings to be happy, focusing on a being that you might have problems with, and slowly cultivating the ability to send them loving kindness. It's called the replacement with opposites, these two things. You replace something that's gone one way with something that sort of goes the other way, an opposite. As for delusion, well, the most obvious way that we counteract delusion in a conventional way is what we're doing here, or what we're doing in general when we study the Buddha's teaching. Our study, asking questions, receiving advice, associating with people who are knowledgeable, so that the talk is often about wholesome things. Just discussing these things, thinking about them, memorizing them, that sort of thing. These are all valuable practices. It's a valuable part of our cultivation of the Buddha's teaching. But to understand really how to free ourselves from these three, of course we have to go deeper, and of course we have to eventually come to practice Satipatthana Vipassana. So we have to understand these three in a relationship, and I mentioned this, how they relate to each other. I was going to talk about this. Greed, anger, and delusion. Greed, we know, is the cause of suffering, or the origin of suffering. Buddha used the word tanha, but it really means the greed. I mean, these are just different words. Tanha means thirst. So it's not suffering, but it's the cause. Greed is the cause of suffering. Or we could say it like this: greed is the problem. The problem is that we have greed. Greed isn't the consequences of the problem, but it's the problem. It's what's causing all of the suffering in our lives, right? That's what a problem does. A problem causes suffering. Anger is the result. So if greed is the problem, the result of that problem is that we get angry. The result, we would say, is suffering, but why do we suffer? We suffer because we want something and we don't get it. You can't always get what you want. And any time you don't get what you want, what is that? That's anger. Or that's disliking, however you want to say it. And where's delusion? Delusion is actually the cause of the greed. Delusion is why we crave things, why we cling to things. The Buddha said the first thing we have to learn is that nothing is, well, the first and last thing that we have to learn is that nothing is worth clinging to. Sabbe dhamma na lang abhinivesaya. No dhamma is worth clinging to. That's it. And that is freedom, that is an expression of freedom from delusion. So the truth is, we actually don't try to fix greed, and we don't try to fix anger. These two have a relationship with each other. Greed creates expectations, and anytime those expectations are not met, anger arises. That's where anger comes from. But greed is the root. Greed is why you get angry. You never get angry if you didn't have expectations that weren't met. If there wasn't things that you prefer over other things, if you didn't have this partiality. But neither one of them would arise if there were not delusion. And delusion is where we focus our attention. If you knew that the things that you cling to are not worth clinging to, then you would never give rise to clinging to them. So this is why the practice of mindfulness and the cultivation of vipassana, seeing clearly, is central to the Buddha's teaching, rather than, for example, metta or loathsomeness, asubha, loathsomeness. When we see clearly, when we see things as they are, and seeing clearly isn't something mysterious. It just means literally seeing the experiences for what they are. As the Buddha said, let seeing just be seeing, let hearing just be hearing, let feeling just be feeling. This is the literal, the quote, explicit teaching of the Buddha, dite ditamatang bhavisati. Seeing will just be seeing. You have to train yourself this way. Seeing will just be seeing, hearing will just be hearing, feeling will just be feeling, thinking will just be thinking. When you cultivate in this way, this is clarity, and this is the absence of delusion. It's very simple. It's not some mysterious or complicated or deep esoteric teaching. The cultivation of that clarity, even just here and now in the present moment. Seeing is just seeing, hearing is just hearing, feeling is just feeling. When you see like that, at that moment there is no delusion. And because there is no delusion, there can be no arising of greed or anger. Moreover, through that cultivation of clarity, there will come this profound shift of perception, where the things you thought were worth clinging to, you suddenly realize, or you slowly and eventually realize are not worth clinging to, until you understand nothing is worth clinging to. That understanding, not intellectually, but directly, experientially, is the point of the goal, what do we call the pinnacle of the Buddha's teaching, the goal, the moment that we're aiming for. At that moment when we realize nothing is worth clinging to, that is the realization of the Four Noble Truths. And that is the moment that leads to enlightenment. The next moment will be an experience of cessation and freedom from suffering. So, these are the three Akusalamūlani. The opposite three are called Kusalamūlani. And Kusalamūlani, we don't have to talk much about them because they're quite simple. It means the mind that is free from greed, free from anger, and free from delusion. It also specifically refers to volitional minds. So there are states of mind that don't have greed, don't have anger, and don't have delusion, but that's because they're a resultant. Anyway, that's just a technicality. The point is, when you intentionally act, you can intentionally act with greed, anger, and delusion, or any number of those three, or you can act without those three. So this is the description of what it means to cultivate a wholesome mind, is when it's free from these three and you have a volitional tendency. So, for example, when you practice mindfulness, every moment that you practice mindfulness is a moment of wholesomeness. The clarity of mind frees you from greed and anger, and so that mind is free from all three of this. So it's called the Kusalamūlani. Non-greed, non-anger, and non-delusion. But anyway, greed, anger, and delusion are the root of all evil. This is an essential part of the Buddha's teaching, something that should be at the tip of our tongues when we talk about the Buddha's teaching. Another thing that it's important for us to know, important for us to keep in our minds. That's the Dhamma for today.